I'm Harville Stricklin. I'm the son of Jimmy Pearl Chenault and William Stuckey Stricklin. My dad was known as Bud. I never knew anybody to call him Bill or William or anything. It's always Bud. That was his name from the time he was a kid, I guess. My mother's maiden name was Chenault, and her mother's name was Blair before she married a Chenault. And we know that the Blair went back to the Civil War. Her grandfather served in the Civil War. We have documentation of his pay records from about 1861. Now, my grandfather on my father's side, George Columbus Stricklin, he came from Arkansas. And the story is that he crossed the river in Texas one step ahead of the sheriff because he had had a fight with their school teacher, and he was a great big boy then, probably 17 years old, and thought he had killed him, and so he struck out for Texas. Turned out that he hadn't killed him, but he thought he had, so he headed for Texas, and as far as I know, he never went back. Anyway, he settled in northeast Texas, and there he met my grandmother, Sarah Chapman, and she was born in Kentucky. And I've been told that she came to North Texas in a covered wagon as a teenager. So they evidently met in northeast Texas around the Greenville area because that's where they lived after they were married. Grandparents, George and Sarah, probably married about 1885. My father was born in 1889. He had a sister that was 2 years older, so I would guess about 1885 when they were married. After they had lived in that area for probably 20 years, they moved to Fort Worth, probably around 1905. Settled on the north side near the packing plants, and bought the house on 27th Street, I think in 1907. That was at 2502 Northwest 27th Street. We lived at 2500 Northwest 27th Street most of my growing years, from about 9 years on up to the time I was married. But we had lived all over 27th Street. Earlier we'd lived at 2403, and we lived at 2325. And earlier than that, I was born on Prairie Avenue in the 2500 block of Prairie Avenue, which was just a few blocks away from. I have an older brother named Clyde. He's now deceased, but he was born on the north side in the 2500 block of Northwest 28th Street. That's about a block from where we had lived on 27th Street. And I and my twin brother, Arville, we were born on Prairie Avenue, 2519, I believe is the correct number. Sister Louise was born on Northwest 27th Street in the 2300 block, about 2325. House no longer exists there. We later moved to 2403 Northwest 27th Street. And in 1927, built a house next to my grandmother at 2500 Northwest 27th Street. My sister Louise was born at the 23 100 block. I mentioned that earlier before, so I'll skip that.
No problem.
My brother Dan, younger brother, 14 years younger than me, he was born at the 2500 Northwest 27th Street address. The people back then that had moved to Fort Worth to the north side primarily came in because of the packing houses, Swift and Armour. Just like a boom town, like an oil boom town, the packing houses just drew people from farmlands and around surrounding places, surrounding counties, into North Fort Worth because the work was there. My dad worked at Swift and Company for 28 years, and one of his favorite sayings was, "Boys, you should never have to get but one job if you do it right." He was proud of being a long-time employee of Swift and Company. Clyde was born on May the 15th, 1915. Arville and I were born on September 1st, 1918. Louise was born on October 24th, 1922. Dan was born January 28th, 1932. I recall that wherever we lived, we always had plenty to eat, clean clothes, and a decent house because my dad had a good job at Swift and Company, and we really didn't have a whole lot, but we had everything we needed. My dad always had a saying that he'd say, "Boys, be honest and pay your debts." And that's the way he lived. My mother was the disciplinarian, I guess you'd call it, of the family. And she made us walk the line. We had to do this, we had to do that. We had chores we had to do. And if we got out of line, she didn't hesitate to say, "Go out and cut me a switch." And we'd go out to the peach tree and cut a little one, and then she'd, "No, you go get another one." And we'd get that switch. We lived one place there on 27th Street that had an old salt cedar tree. And boy, those switches were long and whippy. They'd just wrap around your legs. That was something else. We lived next door to my grandmother there, and we'd go over there, and she'd give us a penny, and that was the greatest thing. Because we didn't have any extra money at the house, but she always managed to find a penny to give us. I remember in her backyard there was a tree, we called it a juju tree. Now I've read about them, they're called something like that, Anyway, they had a little fruit on them, like plums, but they had a skin on the fruit like an apple. They were speckled, and they got to be about an inch long and 3/4 of an inch in diameter, just good bite size, and they tasted a little like an apple. But we call it a juju tree, and never seen one anywhere since. We'd climb that tree and shake it and knock that stuff down on the ground and just fill our pockets with it. What we didn't eat, the birds ate, because kids about don't want to eat any of it. We had outhouses back then, no inside plumbing, and every street had alleys, and they had the city sanitation trucks came up the alleys about once a week and emptied the outhouses. into those big old tanker type trucks. Never forget them. But when they came by, you knew they were in the neighborhood because of the smell. Growing up, Arnold and I, of course, were the same age, and we never had a problem with someone to play with because we could invent games. We played cowboys and Indians and cops and robbers and everything else I guess you could think of. So we never had a problem with having someone to play with. You know, in the neighborhood we had other children, and we always kind of had a gang that we ran with when we were a little older. But when we were younger, we played together. And we had, of course, being identical twins, we had some fun at school and other places because people actually couldn't tell us apart. It was very difficult. I know later on in life, Arvil worked at the Arch and Hole Auto Supply Company, and he drove their city delivery truck. Well, he got promoted to the office, and I was working at a clothing store, so I decided I'd get his job, and I did, driving that truck. Well, it was just like he'd never left the truck because I'd go out delivering to the places where he had been, and the people didn't know I was different. They thought I was the same guy until they'd come into the store and they'd see him in the office and they'd see me on the truck, and then they began to realize that we were two different people. A lot of things happened like that. Growing up, Clyde was 3 years older, and that's a pretty good gap when you're that age. So we didn't really be real close, except in the family way, of course. We all went to school. We all went to church every Sunday. But by the time he was about 12 years old, he was off working in the grocery stores, working on weekends and in the evenings. And he was just kind of really an older brother. So we didn't have an awful lot of time that we spent with him except in the evenings and at mealtime and so forth like that. But Louise, of course, was a little younger, and she was the artist of the family at an early age even. And later on, as she was in probably junior high school, Arvil and I would work on Friday evenings and Saturdays at the Healthy Selfie grocery store. We'd make 50 cents on Friday and 75 cents on Saturday. We'd give Louise 25 cents a week each to pay for her art lessons. We'd give my mother and father 50 cents a week. And the rest of it, we had to, we could kind of spend the rest of it the way we wanted to. But, we were a close-knit family for the most part. I recall that back then, when we were working after school and on Saturday at the grocery store, we were making about 10 cents an hour at that time. Because all day on Saturday was 75 cents. Evenings after school on Friday was 50 cents, so that'd work out about 10 cents an hour. Later on, I worked at a clothing store, the old Hub Clothiers, and this was during the Depression, and jobs were hard to get, and I was glad to get it. But I worked for $1 a day, and they were 10-hour days. And on Saturday evening, I would go up to Leonard's. Leonard's at that time had a grocery store and a donut factory and everything there at their store on Houston Street. I'd walk 2 blocks up to Leonard's. I'd buy a quart of milk for a dime. I'd buy a dozen donuts for a dime. I'd go back to the store and have my Saturday evening meal. I recall that on Saturdays, working that long day at the clothing store, in the evening I'd go over to Leonard Brothers. They had a grocery department and a bakery. And I'd buy a quart of milk and a dozen donuts, take them back to the back room of the store. I'd have my evening meal for Saturday, 20 cents. And that bought a lot of food. Another comparison was that gasoline was very cheap. In 1934, 35, Dad bought a filling station there just a block from where we lived on Azle Avenue. He bought the equipment and the pumps and everything and leased the land. And we sold gasoline at one time for 11 cents a gallon. Had a gas war. We sold it below cost to keep a lot of customers paid on credit. And to keep them coming in so they'd pay their bill, we sold it at less than we paid for it at times. Kind of like the grocery business is now, I guess. You call it a loss leader. But during that gas war, one night, somebody drove around and shot holes in all the pumps. Nobody had any gasoline on Azle Avenue till they got their pumps fixed, except our station. We had a pump off to one side that they missed. So we sold gasoline coming and going because we had the only pump that was working. This was in 1935. The first car that we had, that was about a 1921 Ford. My dad drove it to work. And on Saturday or Sunday, my Uncle Ballard would bring his old Ford down, and they'd work on them. That was a ritual. Every Sunday, they'd work on those Fords. They'd do something. If it was running perfectly, they'd still work on them. They'd tune them up. And that was kind of a hobby that they had. They liked their cars. And later on, he got a 1927 Ford. I recall that before he bought that, he brought home a sedan, they called it. And it had glass windows, it rolled up and down. And my mother said, "I'm not going to ride in that car with all that glass." So he took it back and got the touring car, of course, which was open. And you had the curtains you put up if the weather was bad. Later on, he got a Chevrolet. That's the first time we varied from a Ford. He had a 29 Chevrolet. And he bought a 1933 Ford V8, boy, and that was something classy. It was really classy. And he kept that until, still had it, I guess, when we left the house, got married. And the first car I owned was a 1936 Ford, maroon Ford four-door sedan. It was a beauty. But we got that after we were married. And I paid $400 for that car. Went down to the bank, signed a note, and paid it out by the month. And we drove that car for 10 years. I learned to drive on that 1927 Ford touring car. Dad took me up on Long Avenue, and we went up and down that. There wasn't traffic on it until I learned to drive. Later on, when we were running that filling station, we had an old 1923 Ford touring car that they cut the back out and put a little wooden bed on it to make a little truck out of it. And we hauled ice. We sold ice at the filling station. We had an ice house there. And we'd go down on 25th Street to the ice company and buy 300-pound blocks of ice. It would hold 900 pounds of ice, and we'd bring it up there about once a day. and put it in the ice house and sell it out 25 pounds or 50 pounds at a time. But you could hear that old 1923 Ford coming as far as you could hear it. 3 or 4 or 5 blocks away. It sounded like all the pistons were swapping holes, but it would haul the ice. I met my wife in 1933. We'd gone to a party, like kids have parties, birthday parties, so forth, at a friend's house, and she had invited Bessie Joe to come to that party. And first time I had seen her, and this was just before school started in 1933 in the junior high school. So we met, and then later on at school, we got to know each other, and actually didn't start dating until we were in high school, about 3 or 4 years later, and dated all the way through high school, and even that was in 1936, and dated for the next 4 years until we were married in 1940. So we had I guess you'd call a rather lengthy courtship. We had together for several years before we were married. Just before the war, we had all gone our separate ways, except Dan, of course. He was still with the family. And Clyde enlisted first. He went into the Navy, into the Seabees. That's where he wanted to be. And he made a pretty good place for himself in the Seabees. He had gone to New Guinea, spent a lot of time in the Pacific area over there. Arvil went in next. He was drafted in 1942. And he went through his training in California and got into an anti-aircraft battalion. He went overseas to the European theater and went through the Battle of the Bulge and ended up in Germany. I was drafted in 1943. I had been delayed because I was working at that time at the bomber plant, which was Consolidated Vultee at that time. Anyway, I was drafted in 1943. And I went to California for my infantry training, Camp Roberts. I spent 2 more cycles through there as cadre and training others. And then to get out of that place, I volunteered for an overseas assignment. I was picked and sent to the counterintelligence school at Fort Meade, and not Fort Meade, but at Hollibird Signal Depot in Baltimore, Maryland. I went through the CIC school and was given an assignment to Japan. Went home on my POM furlough, got back to Baltimore, and orders had been changed. I was sent to Washington, D.C., and spent the rest of the time at CIC headquarters in Washington, D.C. I worked with the Un-American Activities Committee and other phases of the intelligence work there until I was discharged in July 1946. So that ended the war era for us. Before we leave the World War II, I've thought of something that was kind of a coincidence, I guess, but you never know. Arvil was wounded when an artillery shell hit the truck that he was riding in over in Germany. And later on, I found out that on that same day, I was injured in a training incident. I was cadre. I was drilling a soldier in the proper use of the bayonet. And he was a kind of a dimwit, and he had forgotten to fix his bayonet properly. And when he made the chopping motion that you do with the bayonet, that thing came off and it stabbed me down into my lower abdomen, stuck in there, and I was bleeding like a hog. So I had to go off to the hospital. But I later found out that it happened on the same day that Orville was injured. So that was kind of a coincidence. After the war, in fact, before the war, my dad had seemed like after we left home, he sold that place on 2500 Northwest 27th Street and bought a lot out in what is now River Oaks off of 183. It was only a one-lane highway at that time. But he built that house there in 1941. And of course, he didn't have any money coming in except his little old pension, $36 a month. Going back to my father, he had to retire at an early age. He had to retire in 1934 because he had heart problems, what we would call now congestive heart failure. They didn't call it then that, but that's what it was. And they retired him on what was not a bad pension at that time, $9 a week, $36 a month. But he had to scramble around sometimes to make ends meet. Bought that service station, and we made a little money there, I guess, but sold it. He did a little cattle trading down on the stockyards with old Pink Cantrell, who ran the grocery store across from our service station, and they traded cattle. But then after the family left, he wanted to move out a little further from north side, so he bought a lot out there, and he built another home. He lived there for several years until 1946. And he sold that for a nice profit there on that corner of 183. He got $15,000 for a place that probably cost him $3,000 all told. So he built another house on the corner of Long Avenue and Ohio Garden Road. It was the Rock House. He lived there about 3 years. He sold it for a profit, and that's why he made money, kept the family going. He'd build a house, live in a little while, upgrade it, sell it for a profit. And at the time he died in 1948, they were building a new house, which they never got to move into, but they were building another house on Ohio Garden Road, just a block from where the one they had sold. My wife and I, Bessie Jo, we were married in 1940, June 30th, 1940. April 11th, 1942, our daughter Lynn was born, our only child. She married in 1962, and she has 2 children, Robin, who was born in 1965, and Russell, 1966, 2 grandchildren. Russell has 3 children. Robin has 2 children. So we have 5 great-grandchildren. In addition to being quite a talented artist, our sister Louise liked to write poetry. And over the years, she's written a good number of poems. And one of my favorites that well, it doesn't really relate to anything that I can recall in childhood, but she liked to think about nice places and places in the country and so forth. But let me just read this for you, and you be your own judge, okay? It's entitled The Vacant Lot. We didn't have a country lane or a 100-acre plot, but just across the street we had a vacant city lot. In springtime there were wildflowers nestled in among the weeds, and they glistened in the sunlight like a string of jeweled beads, little purple buttercups, and dainty Queen Anne lace, a tuft of yellow daisies with dewdrops on their face. Tall, rugged grass grew green and sweet, where black-eyed Susans gnawed and butterflies stopped silently upon a milkweed pod. Through all the lazy summer days, their winsome colors reigned, and I wandered there among them until the sunlight waned. Childhood days have come and gone, but the memories I've got remind me of the loveliness of that old vacant lot. I recall one summer when I was 16. Arvel and I and about three other of the kids that we ran around with there in the neighborhood took a summer job that lasted several weeks at a farm out on the Weatherford Highway, which was quite a ways out at that time. And this guy's name was John Conde. And he had a big farm, about 100 and 200 acres. And we went out, and the first few days, first few weeks, we shocked wheat. Then after that, we pulled onions. He had big fields of these big white onions. We pulled onions. And then we went back through that field and in a day or two after they dried in the sun a little while, and we threw them up in the bed of a pickup truck, took them to the barn and grated those onions. He had a big grating shed where you rolled all those onions down a big board that had holes in it, and the big ones fell in the big hole, the little ones fell in the little hole. That's how you graded them by side, just through a big board. And then we'd store them up in the loft of his barn. And then he had beans. We picked beans. Did odd jobs during the summer, and that paid the whole 10 cents an hour. We came home with $1.20 every day, 12 hours work. And it was quite an experience because we, city kid, and we didn't have anything to relate to farm work, but we got a little taste of it at that time.
Well, I was in J.P. Elder the last year before going to Northside High School, and I saw Arvel. He was passing notes to this girl on the school ground. And of course, a bunch of us girls would always go out and see what he looked like. And so I knew how he looked before I really met him in high school. Well, when I went to Northside High School, the old red school building on Park Street, that's where I actually met Arvel, not at school, but Bessie Jo Stricklin and I lived two houses apart, and we went to parties in a group that we called the gang. It was just friends from all over Northside. And I met Arvel at one of the parties, and we started dating. We had lots of fun. We played Spin the Bottle and all those old games that don't cost any money. And we got together fairly often. Bessie Jo and I became close friends when I lived at 1609 Denver, and she lived one house. There were two houses between us. We moved to 1609 Denver Avenue on the north side, and I met a very good friend there, Bessie Jo Stricklin. She lived two houses down from me, and we cleaned house together on Saturdays. She had two brothers, and we even scrubbed the wood floors so they'd be nice and clean. And I remember that she made the best biscuits I had ever put in my mouth. And I loved to eat with her when she would invite me. she made spaghetti that I really enjoyed. I remember that. Anyway, and we met several friends that we all knew and went to parties at some of the parents' houses. We always congregated and were chaperoned. We had lots of fun, and Arvil and I started dating then.
What year was that?
Bessie Jo and I started dating the twins at the same time. This was my first year of high school, and Arvil was in Glee Club, and he sang with let's see, he took voice lessons too down there. I was too poor to take the voice lessons. He took it downtown from Victor B. Akers, I remember that. And some of the group that we partied with also took voice lessons.
Was he pretty much?
Well, he had a beautiful voice. He had a beautiful baritone voice. And he used to sing when we were out on the way home. And when we dated, I had a 11 o'clock curfew. And we would drive around on the north side or wherever coming home and always turn down, this is when we lived on Prairie Street. I'm ahead of myself. We lived at 2305 Prairie.
Yeah, we'll hold off.
Arvil was born September the 1st, 1918, here in Texas. I was born February 25th, 1919, near Prague, Oklahoma. We were married September the 16th, 1939. He gave me the engagement ring the year before, and he said that we'd wait until he was 21. We were married at the home of Reverend Paul Lupo, who was one of the pastors at the church where I was going, in front of his fireplace. And I had a rose corsage. That's the first time I ever had red roses. It was a short ceremony, and I didn't even have a new dress, but it didn't matter.
Okay.
Okay, but because he sang with this quartet every morning at 6 o'clock on KFJZ, and I wanted some tapes of that, but I have no earthly idea how I would ever get them. I think Clyde was the main butcher up there, but I wouldn't swear to it. But Clyde did work there at one time, so I feel like that he got Arvil, the job there. We were married on September the 16th, 1939, in the home of the pastor Paul Lupo, where I went to church. We lived at that time in a 2-room upstairs apartment at my boss's house, big 2-story house over on Riverside Drive. I worked for Harry Keaton Broom Mattress and Upholstery Supplies at the big salary, starting $5.88 a week. Of course, by the time we married, I was making $15.88. Arvil worked for Arch and Hold Auto Supply Company on Lexington Street, and he was making about the same thing, and he was a truck driver. He would sometimes pick me up at the bus stop and motor me down 2 or 3 blocks to where I worked and then go back to work. They didn't know this, I'm sure. When we were married, I was in the choir at the First Baptist Church downtown, and he also attended with me, and he sang every morning at 6 a.m. on KFJZ in a quartet known as the Sunrise Quartet. They had a very, very good quartet, one of the highest tenors that I think I've ever heard. They sang all the good old religious songs, and they sang for probably a year or more.
Okay, that's good.
Arvil had gone overseas in 1942, and in August the 21st, 1944, we had a bouncing baby boy born, and we named him Arvil. And when his daddy got home, he got home in the middle of the night, and of course, we were in bed, and Arvil Jr. pulled up to the end of the bed and looked over and said, "Daddy," because I had shown him his picture all the time that my husband was overseas, so that he'd know his dad when he came home. Arvil was drafted March 27, 1942, and he went to Camp Callan, California. That's, I believe, it's San Diego. And he stayed there for some time, and then he was sent out to the Mojave Desert. And it was during that time that I made 2 trips on the bus to California, to Riverside, to visit him, and he would come in from the Mojave Desert for the visit. He was in several places in the United States, but in December 1943, he was shipped overseas. He was in London for a very short time, and then he really went to war. He was with the 440th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Automatic Weapons Battalion, and they were all over Europe. At one point, I remember him telling me that he drove a Jeep all over Europe for the bigwig. I don't know what he was, a general or something. In January 1945, the 440th Anti-Aircraft Automatic Weapon Battalion was attached successively to the 70th U.S. Army and the 1st French Army in this fighting, culminating in the liquidation of the Colmar Pocket, incidentally shooting down the first German jet-propelled aircraft on the Western Front at coordinates V820670. Somewhere in the European section, he was on a truck. They were moving some soldiers to another area, and he was standing near the back, and a shell hit the truck, and he received shrapnel wounds in his leg. There were a number of the soldiers that were killed. He was very lucky. God was watching over him. After Arvil came back, we bought either a 31 or 32 Model A Ford. It was just as black as it could be and shiny. It had a trunk on the back. It had wire wheels. It had 2 spare tires mounted next to the engine, and each of them had this chrome cover on it. It was really a pretty little car. And in the back, behind the window, up on the wall of the car, was these little vases, one on each side. Anyway, I really enjoyed driving the car, and Arvil Jr. and I drove back and forth from Waco to Fort Worth several times in that little car. We moved back from Waco, and we had just bought this house at 4420 Lawrence Road in April of 1948. It closed. If we had bought it in December of 43, we would have paid $3,200. We ended up paying $7,200 for it. When we first moved in here, they moved the couch in first, I'll tell this. And a little boy down the street, the same age as Arvil, barefooted and in his shorts, marched in the front door, sat down on the couch, and sat there until every stick of furniture was moved in the house, and they have been friends ever since. We lived here several years, and then on July 21st, 1949, another son was born, and we named him Mark. And when I came home from the hospital, back then you stayed in the hospital about a week, and you came home in an ambulance, and they delivered you into your bed on a gurney. And Arvil Jr. came out the door and down the sidewalk, and as soon as he could clasp my hand, he held on until he got to the porch and had to let go because I had been gone a few days. Long time ago, we had a cabin at Lake Weatherford. It was 106 Westlake Drive. It was bare land with lots of trees on it, and we had to clear it and then build a cabin. And I designed the cabin open because the house at home was small. We had 2 bedrooms, and the rest of it, there were twin beds and a couch that made a bed. And we used to have lots of people come out and enjoy the lake with us. Jerry Kellum taught Arvil and Mark both how to drive a boat because my husband thought they were too young. Anyway, also probably taught them to ski. And one time, Jerry Kellum was skiing behind a boat, and they had been down to the end of the lake that I couldn't see them, down by the dam, skiing. And here he came, skiing, and Mark was standing on his shoulders. And I think Mark was just probably 7 or 8 years old. Anyway, my heart fell right then, but they never got hurt. In 1977, I went to work at the City of River Oaks, started in the water department, was moved over to the tax department, and became over that department. 1982, Arvil passed away, and I continued working until 1989, at which time I retired and have enjoyed retirement since that time. It's now the year 2000.